about civil rights. We covered a bit about, Martin Luther King and what he did, and then JFK. But it was really from that era onwards. But it's only actually when you come to America out with, you really start to understand what the African American Black communities faced. What I've noticed when I started to research it was ownership of asset. Mm-hmm. It's like, so the wealth in America, for people who don't know out there, is up until probably the 1930s, 1940s, until the Federation of Housing Association was created, only the uber wealthy could actually own property. Mm-hmm. So the old loans used to be able to have to put down, I think, about 80% up front, and you could take a 20% loan over 5 years. So unless you were very wealthy, it didn't matter which color you were. It was just like, it was very much kept to the super wealthy. The same happened back in the UK and nearly all countries. You know what I mean? That was it. The landowners were the very rich, the aristocracy that owned that. So when the Federation Housing Association, this is what I've learned, they came along in the 30s and 40s, and specifically after post-World War II, they created a new system whereby people could start to get 80% loans on their property over a 30-year period. Mm-hmm. So what they were able to do was they can actually borrow money now, like the way we borrow money here. So people can come in and get loans from that. But the saddest thing that I saw with that was the African American communities were excluded from being access to these loans, basically. Now, if you think you're middle-class American, middle-class white American right now, unless you've come from the very uber wealthy, the reason you've got wealth, the reason you've gone to education is essentially through property ownership of your grandfather, grandmother, and it's been passed down from generation. And if you're looking at the type of loans, and this is research I've been doing, the type of loans that were given out, we're talking about like $8,000, $10,000 back at that time. But the property's value now is up to like $500,000. And during that period, it's the wealth in the property and owning the asset that's actually allowed the future generations to buy their own property because they've managed to take equity out and put it down as the down payment. And then also it's allowed them to access education because this is where the money's come from. So if you're looking back 50, 60 years ago, very few people went to universities. Mm-hmm. And the only way they started to afford to go to universities is because they became middle class through property ownership. And through property ownership, this allowed them to actually take money out and pay for their kids to go to university and get them educated there as well. But if you actually look, the African American community wasn't even allowed to access these loans. Yeah. If people talk about, institutional racism in banking, my dad's a bank manager and he's like old school bank manager. You know what I mean? So if you speak to my dad, he's a great business guy, old school bank manager. This is the way it works. But for coming from something like this and to see how this was set up in this country is basically unbelievable, really. I think JFK changed the rule, and that was not until like in the 1960s, I think in 1968, mm-hmm. that he actually changed the rule that African American people could even access. That didn't even actually allow you to access the loans themselves. What that did, it basically meant the rules were you weren't actually stopped from getting it. But within some of the communities where people went from inner cities and moved into suburbs, they had to sign loan documents with conditions that you weren't going to sell your house to an African American person.
Yeah, redlining is very good. Again,
redlining.
Yeah.
If you want to give a bit of explanation about that as well, because I think this is important for people to do, because I want to speak about asset ownership and tokenization and why that comes in. But mm-hmm. that's my understanding. If you want to, you know more about this, if you want to speak a bit about that as well, Talisha.
Well, we were, again, regulated to live in certain areas. And that was to, again, this is specifically World War II. We're talking about coming home and the GIs having the ability to take advantage of, land ownership. And again, most of us who were, served, I know my family is a military family and have all served and weren't allowed to buy homes. And so you had to constantly rent and you weren't allowed to live in certain areas. And that's where, again, the inner city districts were started to be zoned for where you could live as an African American, and you weren't allowed and permitted to live in the suburbs. And it's all interesting how, again, we've seen the gentrification kind of happening where people want to move back into the city, but now they don't want to still live within a Black community. And this continues to go on. Our predatory loans, like I said, when we were able to access the loans, the percentage in interest rates were astronomical. No one else had those. And we still see some of those remnants even today. Our houses are appraised at a lower rate. Everything about the system is really not centric for us to have the equity and to grow our wealth as anybody else. So I would say, oh, you have the ability to do exactly what we do. Well, we're starting with like 1,000 steps behind, and it's not the same. So even in the educational aspect, going to school, yes, before we weren't even allowed to go to institutions. We created our own institutions, and then we weren't allowed to have loans to take out for that. But even now, our loan access is still much higher than anyone else's. So we pay almost 3 to 4% more for our student loans than any other community does. So there's always these things that, like I said, we're trying to make equity is really what it is. It's not, well, we're not striving for equality because that's not something that's even viable at this point, but we just need an equitable system. And I do think that's where this technology starts to allow that to actually manifest.
Yeah, I read an article. It was a guy who was an investment banker. He was African American. He had credit score of like 800, which I'd love to have a credit score 800, you know. But even then, he went in and he basically did this research. He had like great paying job, super high credit, and he went to your traditional banks. This was like last year, and it was in the New Yorker. And he basically was getting interest rates of like 4.5%.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then they had someone else going into the same thing with the less scores, and they were getting interest rates of 3%. And this is somebody who's like working in it was basically an investment banker, high paid salary, you know, highly educated, access to that, but you're getting a 1.5%, and that's from just banks. You know, it's just like, and that's like, and they're not breaking the rules. This is like the rules are set up. It's just it's basically unbelievable, you know. And I know with the Black Lives Matter movement and everything else they're speaking about, but we're only speaking about essentially banking rates, you know. And as you said, you couldn't even get access to this opportunity to own your own property anyway, unless it was with these sort of horrible buyback type mortgages, whereby if you miss one payment, you lose your house. You know, and then you're paying like super high rates. You can't get in any places. It's really just an and coming from Scotland and you're reading this stuff, it's just like, it's unbelievable for people back in the UK to think something like this would go on there. Now, obviously, they've got their own problems with what's happened in history. You know, it's Britain's basically invaded 93% of the world. So, you know, so basically we're the cause of most problems back in the day. You know, Buckingham Palace. You know, they're trying to make it wasn't their fault.
We understand. I think this is the globalization really helps people to understand that, you know, what we face is something that, again, there's some residual aspects to this. But as a person who is born and raised here, understanding and coming from the family that I come from, so I understand how disparate our treatment has been over the time frame. And that's, again, the stories that go on. Like I said, I have military personnel, individuals who were literally born as slaves and that saw desegregation happen. So there's a lot that goes on, but you can see how that disenfranchisement really is our legacy. That becomes the thing we hand down instead of, you know, wealth. And I think people forget that, like, oh, wealth is passed down. But yes, poverty also is passed down. And that's a hard thing to escape. And you're making all the moves that you can. I know, like I said, my parents weren't educated formally. Then all of my siblings and myself are, but that also has a cost to it. So we have to put ourselves into debt because, again, no one gave us the ability to go to college. We had to work our way through that. And that also inhibits. Now, I'm about to send my child who's 18 to college, and it's still that same, like, ooh, we got to figure out how to pay for that. And these are the kind of things that really, you know, kind of the trajectory of your life is changed by the opportunities you have at the very early stages. It's hard to, again, catch up, and you already know that you're behind. So you have to really be very cognizant of the choices you make. And I think that's where this new technology really does kind of level set. We don't get this chance often. And that's what we try to tell our community, that this is a once in a lifetime chance to make a very distinct change. Tokenization of assets, that digitization of things that we can now own. When we're typically only consumers in this country, this is really a strong change that has a impact that we would not see in our lifetime if we don't